Welcome to the second episode of my new series called This Happened Here. In this series, I will be bringing you true stories, the good and the bad, of what happened here in Tennessee and anywhere else I find interesting stories to share with you. Today, I will be bringing you the story of Brushy Mountain State Penitentiary. While I was creating this piece, I wanted to tell it from an eyewitness's point of view. This eyewitness, quote unquote, I made him up, being an inmate of that prison, somehow had an accent. I'm not good at accents, but I wanted to tell it just as how the story presented itself to me. So here is a story of what happened at the Brushy Mountain State Penitentiary on Friday, June 9th, 1977. Well, it was finally the day James Earl Ray had been waiting for. It was June 9th, 1977. 7 o'clock had passed and going on to 7:30 p.m. This time would be different, he thought. He would have the help he needed to escape Brushy Mountain State Penitentiary. He had been here since March 21st, 1970. 7 years, and he needed to get out. He had tried before and had failed, but this time he had the rest of the guys to help him. He knew the world hated him for killing one of the greatest civil rights leaders of all time, Martin Luther King Jr. But that was no never mind to him. He was going to escape. It was hotter than the devil's butthole in the yard that day, but he walked out into the open and just stood there, staring up at the sky, trying to stay away from the other inmates. He didn't want anyone getting on about his plan. So he stood in the dying sun and looked over at Douglas Shelton. He was the guy that had supplied their means of escape. Douglas looked at him and slightly nodded his head. No one else saw that, just guys that needed to. So it was on, and a feeling of excitement mixed with nervousness and fear leaped inside his chest. Then he looked over at Larry Hacker. He signaled his acknowledgment. Then Earl L. Jr. walked by him and looked dead in his eyes. He didn't nod or say nothing, but James knew he too was ready. Then James walked casually by Donald Kaler. He too showed his sign of being ready by just winking his eye. Now everything was in place. So they started to move one by one into the shadow of the wooden tower. This was the best spot for their escape. Though the wall was 12 feet high, electrified, and had a barbed wire to boot, there was an 18-inch gap where the mountain and the wire met. That was big enough for them to squeeze under. They didn't care none about dropping down when they got over, because they had heard tell that the ground was soft over by where they would land. Erosion had caused dirt to build up in a pile against that wall, and the dirt was soft, so it would cushion their fall some. They stood in the shadows, watching Floyd Hooks. He was sitting up at his post in the guard tower. He was a creature of habits, and would take the paper to read every day up there. At times, he would be so engrossed in that story that he would sometimes be a while before he looked up. The 5 men waited and watched, all the time taking out the pieces of pipe Donald had fashioned to make a ladder. James took his piece from under his shirt and handed it to Douglas. Larry, he popped his out of the waist of his pants. Then Earl bent and dug his pipe out from under the dirt by the fence, where he had it stashed some time before, and handed it over to Douglas. Donald had his in the foot of his pants, and he bent and pulled it out. He had some trouble with that thing, but after a few tugs it came loose, and he handed it to Douglas too. He still had dirt on it. Heck, it's 'cause he had just taken it from behind the rock where he had hidden it days ago. So they took turns looking up at Floyd, trying not to look suspicious, watching him like they had done every day before, trying to document his habits. As usual, he was turning the pages of his newspaper, not paying them no near mind. The moment his head went down, Ray signaled to someone in the yard, and he screamed some. Then a fight immediately broke out. Floyd's head finally shut up, and he got his weapon ready. Poor thing didn't see what was happening right under his nose, and boy, would he forever get flack for it. Douglas, he already had all the pieces in hand that he needed, so he quickly put them together, forming a crudely makeshift 12-foot ladder. He tossed it over the fence it hooked there, tested it, and sure enough, it was ready. He did it right the first time, so in an instant James Earl Ray was up and over. Then Larry Hacker jumped on, and he too was over the wall and out of sight. Earl Hill Jr. looked around and saw that everyone was off watching the fight. They were still undetected, so he climbed up and was over in no time. Then Donald Kaler followed, and jumping on last was Douglas Shelton. All the inmates were now over the wall, adrenaline surging inside their bodies, and they were out. Douglas turned and reached up to pull the pipe over and out of sight when he felt a tug on it. He looked up and saw coming over, climbing on the pipe, was David Lee Paul. David had spotted them when he caught sight of them going over the wall from the prison dining room, where he was still cleaning up after supper. Upon spotting them, he threw down his sponges and rags, hightailed down the stairs, and raced across the yard in hopes of using the pipe to make a run for it as well. No sooner had he dropped down when he saw and heard a few shots hit above his head. Jerry Ward fell over the fence and fell to the ground at his feet. Linwood Butler, one of the guards, had got him. But the other inmates were already off and running up the hillside. They were not waiting around to find out about who, what, where, or how something happened. It was every man for himself. Adrenaline kicked in for Ward, and although he was bleeding from his head and shoulder, he too was on his feet in a flash and running up that mountain. Fear took over, energizing their steps, and they were moving fast. Suddenly, they all heard the sirens go off, signaling their escape. It echoed off the mountain 7 times, signaling the escape of 7 convicts. They were discovered. For a split second, James stopped to look back. His plan had only included 4 other inmates. Where the hell did the other 2 come from? But he had no time to ponder on this. He had to climb. They ran hard, putting everything they had into climbing up that mountain. But it was hard going. Their legs were not used to being pushed to this limit, having only been used for walking around the yard. But still they ran, across the river, up the mountain, and through the bramble. It might have been a bad map, or in haste they had taken a wrong turn somewhere, but after running for miles they knew this was not the right way. So they decided to split up and hope for the best. They could hear the sounds of hundreds of pursuers coming after them, the police chopper whooping over their heads, and the sniffer dogs Sandy and Little Red gaining on them every second. The first inmate to be captured was Ward. He had only enjoyed a few minutes of freedom when they cornered and cuffed him. He was bleeding profusely, and having no way of patching himself up, could not make it far, and so he was immediately caught. All the inmates would be captured in 2.5 days, though. So 42 hours later, David Lee Powell, the only black man to escape with the group that day, was caught. And on Sunday, Larry looked out the one-room church window located in the New River community and saw a group of officers coming in. He fell to his knees and prayed to God that they wouldn't open fire. They didn't, but cuffed him and took him back to Brushy Mountain. Later that night, in the same vicinity, right up by that same church where Larry was hiding, at 10:30 p.m., Earl Ill knew that his freedom was now over. He too would be placed in handcuffs and taken back to prison. The night was falling, and though all the chaos, Sniffer Dog Sandy and Little Red sniffed and searched up the mountain, through the river, across the railroad track. Then at 2 a.m., 54 hours since James Earl Ray had escaped, the dog stopped right by a pile of leaves, and under the pile was James. He was laying on the ground covered in leaves trying to hide his scent, but that was a fail. His head and hands were uncovered. He looked up and saw the shotgun pointed right at his head. It was cocked and ready to shoot. He dared not try anything. Then he was asked if he was hurt, and he answered, "No, I'm okay." And that's all he wrote, thus ending the 2.5 days of one of the biggest manhunts in East Tennessee's history. He was immediately cuffed and proudly paraded in front of the reporters like a trophy. He was caught. And as the door slammed once again behind him in the most notorious maximum prison, he reflected on what he had done. He hated he was back here, but at least he was alive. Not that he deserved it for killing the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., but here he was again. A few days later, the rest of the escapees were caught, ending one of the greatest prison breaks of all time. James Earl Ray did try to escape a couple more times. Heck, they did even blame the 22 stabbed wounds he got from the 4 inmates as a sign of him trying to escape. But the only escape he got was when he died at the age of 74 from hepatitis. He had got that from the blood transfusion he received when he was treated for those stab wounds, which was something, wasn't it? Anyway, he would finally be free after his death, as like I said, at the ripe old age of 74. And his body was cremated and taken back to Ireland, where he's from. Well, here and now ends the story of how James Earl Ray, the man who was sentenced for killing the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., and how he escaped Brushy Mountain State Penitentiary in one of the biggest escapes of East Tennessee. Okay, so now that we have come to the end of this story, I hope you enjoyed it. If so, please give it a like and consider subscribing so that you can stay in the loop for the rest of the series, which I will upload at least once a week. So stay tuned, and I look forward to having you on the next one. Take care and goodbye.